I'll try and speak into the computer. Tell me if it's not working well.
You're good. Well, welcome to the program today, Nick. Great to have you on.
Thanks for having me, Simon.
The first question I always like to ask people is, how did you come to Treasury and what made you choose Treasury as your career?
It's actually not a very interesting or exciting story, and maybe how a lot of careers start sort of happenstance. I was doing investment banking, had been doing it for about 7 years with business school mixed in there. Wasn't really proactively looking for another career when the then treasurer at PG&E reached out to me to ask if I'd be interested in joining PG&E. They were a client of mine, so I knew the company, but to be honest, hadn't really thought of joining them or becoming a treasurer. But was after talking to him, understanding a little bit more what the role was all about, thinking about what I enjoyed about banking, and a lot of the similarities with going sort of in-house. I thought I'd take a try at it. And I always thought I could go back to banking if it didn't work out or if I didn't like it. And turned out being the best decision I ever made, and ended up having a great 15-year career at PG&E.
Making that move from the banking side to corporate treasury can be challenging. Obviously he approached you. It sounds like it was an easier move. Is there anything you'd recommend for others trying to make that move, or if they are finding it hard?
Yeah, actually, I don't know if maybe I misspoke. I don't know if I would say it was an easy move. And to be quite honest and candid, I almost didn't make it. I had to have sort of a sit down with the treasurer at the time. There's a lot of differences and some similarities between banking and sort of going in-house into a corporation. Obviously, in banking, you are managing a certain type of employee. I'm being very stereotypical here, but it's more filled with employees who are really gung-ho, live to work, very, sort of A-type personality, want to climb the corporate ladder. Not so much the case, at least at PG&E and in corporate America, very smart people. But you don't have that same mindset of people are willing to work all weekend, all night. Quality of life, balance is much more important, which I've come now to fully respect. And I thought I knew that going in and tried to tone it down. But it was a little rocky at first from a leadership perspective. Came to the realization that, you can't say, leave it on my desk when you leave. People don't live to work, at least in corporate America, at least my experience. And there's more of a balance, and you have to respect that. I remember joining PG&E, and I was shocked at the time when I talked to my team and learned that not everyone wanted to climb the corporate ladder, so to speak. And I've realized now that's a great thing. People have different goals in life, and not everyone sort of has that dream to get promoted or to move up to be CEO or whatever it is. But that was eye-opening for me, coming from sort of investment banking into corporate America. And it definitely takes a different type of leadership skill. I thought I knew how to manage people from banking. You manage deal teams, you manage analysts, and newly minted MBAs. But very different skills needed to manage a diverse employee base, at least at PG&E. And like I said, it had some rocky, it was not as smooth as it could be. And I think I learned from some mistakes and hopefully grew from those.
And you were at Morgan Stanley, so, the sort of the A standard within that. Was it just the cultural change that you struggled with, or was it the work as well?
I think it was the cultural change. One thing that I was very, very pleasantly surprised going to at least PG&E was the quality of the employees. I was fortunate in investment banking at Morgan Stanley to be really surrounded by, some would say, the cream of the crop, really smart people, top educations. And then you work with clients in the C-suite and really had exposure to really smart people. It's one thing I loved about investment banking. And I always was a little worried going to PG&E that wouldn't be the case. And I would say I was pleasantly surprised that people there are extremely smart, same quality of education. It's just, they have a different mentality. There isn't this drive to, I have to get promoted by a certain year, a certain date. I have to move up the corporate ladder. And so it was more just this mentality that you can't expect people, at least back then it was cell phones. I guess now it would be emails or maybe text. People don't check their cell phones all weekend. They're not working till 9 p.m. at night. And I think that was the eye-opening experience for me, that I had to sort of dial back that expectation of work life. I do think people are very, very smart. There's more balance, which is great. I think there was a good it was a lesson for me in life in general, that the world is very diverse. You don't experience that, unfortunately, as much in investment banking, where it attracts a certain one type of person, maybe not one type, but a certain type of
there's
employee.
definitely a stereotype that people fit in when they go into the banking side. That's for sure. And obviously, you've had 15 years now with PG&E. So despite the clash early there, where you weren't sure if it was right for you, you've stayed a very long time. What would you say have been some of the most interesting things that you've learnt while you've been at PG&E for those 15 years, and what's kept you there so long?
Yeah, I think 15 years is a long time, and I would say I was very fortunate to have bosses along the way, CFOs, who took a interest in my career and my employee development, and really helped me expand my skill set beyond just treasury. And I think that's the number one reason why I stayed there as long as I did. A lot of people move around within corporate America, within PG&E. People have many different careers. That's one reason a lot of people stay there for so long. I didn't move around as much. I always seemed to have one foot within treasury, which I liked. I love the treasury, the work, the interaction, the intellectual stimulation. But I also was able to take on additional responsibilities along the way. I managed our risk management team for a couple of years. I managed our payment services group, which is not a function typically associated with treasury, because my boss at the time thought I needed to learn how to manage a large team that was driven by processes and metrics. And so that was a skill set that I sort of hopefully developed in that experience. Probably my biggest challenge and opportunity was when I managed our budgeting, our FP&A group, for a couple of years. So I think it was those experiences along the way that kept it interesting. I always sort of thought that I would stay at any job as long as that learning curve was upward sloping. And it can definitely be upward sloping within treasury. There's always new markets to learn about, different financial environments, where you learn new skills. But I think added to that, the ability to learn different functions within a finance organization really kept me motivated, interested, and kept me there as long as I stayed.
I know we spoke last week, and we were chatting about, the regulated utility environment, how it's very debt heavy, and a lot of debt capital markets type work. So that's always the sexy, interesting stuff that people are involved in from Treasury as well.
Yeah, that definitely kept it interesting. But I think if I had only done bond deals and credit facilities for 15 years, I probably would have even gotten bored of that. That is the more sexy stuff. So I'm not saying it's not fun. But really what kept me there as long as I stayed was that sort of variety of experiences and learning different functions within finance. I can honestly say I don't know if I would have stayed there if I was just focused on even just the sexy part.
Absolutely. And differences in environments, right? I mean, PG&E has obviously gone through a really tough time recently, and going through the bankruptcy. Whilst it's a tough time, I find a lot of people look back on those experiences fondly and say, it wasn't great going through it, but now as I look back, it actually was a really good experience.
Oh, 100%. And unfortunately at PG&E, we've had a few of those. And corporate America's had a few of those. I think the most challenging experience that I went through, that I'm also probably the most proud of, is the global financial crisis. Not that you would wish that experience upon anyone, and I didn't realize it at the time going through, but that was probably my proudest and accomplishments, helping PG navigate that period, raising capital, ensuring liquidity, the lessons we learned, the liquidity risk management tools and processes we put in place from that experience. It was definitely the most challenging, but also the most educational experience that I went through. And I think that's very similar to what a lot of treasurers are going to be going through now with this unfortunate pandemic. Obviously not something any of us wished, of course, But I think, as I always tell young employees, with challenges comes opportunities. And this is a time when I really think treasurers will be asked to step up, take more of a leadership role, have more of a direct impact on success of these companies managing through this obviously horrific situation. And I bet people will look back with the same sort of comments I made about the global financial crisis and say they learn more than they ever have in this experience.
Yeah, I totally agree. And in actual fact, that's what I'm hearing a lot is it's kind of the same, but it's kind of different because at the moment, like that was a week or two of really, really bad, and then we're working out of it. Whereas at the moment, we're in this sort of pause type scenario where we don't know where the end is yet. And everyone's sort of looking at it going, how do we navigate this without having an end? So yeah, interesting that it's similar. But
yeah, I'm sure there'll be similarities and differences, but new experiences.
In terms of networking then, Nick, how have you approached that in your career and advice to others?
Yeah, it's interesting as being at PG&E for 15 years and even before that, just at Morgan Stanley for 5 years. Obviously, I haven't moved around a lot, and I just give that background a little bit because I think it gives some context on my answer, which is I haven't taken a very proactive approach to networking. So I don't know if it's it's more as I do as I say versus do as I do. I'm a people person. And so when people would reach out to me for career advice or wanted to grab coffee or wanted help navigating PG&E, I would always, I relish those opportunities and would always take people up on those invitations. But I did it not for any sort of strategic networking reason. It was more of a reactive, just, sort of help the other fellow, so to speak. And also I enjoy interacting with people. And so that's the way, I don't know if I didn't call it networking back then, but it was just sort of developing relationships. And as I come out of PG&E now, I'm fortunate, I am a people person, and through developing those relationships, I'd like to think I have a deep contact list, and I didn't mean to develop a huge LinkedIn connection list, but I actually fortunately have it just because of those interactions. But I'm realizing now that to be a really effective networker, and I probably should have done this more so when I was at PG&E, was to take a more proactive approach versus reactive in developing those relationships. Like an example, obviously as a treasurer, you attend a ton of conferences, you meet people, they give you a business card. I probably should have made more of an effort to follow up on those relationships, connect with them through LinkedIn or even just through email, or building out sort of a contact list that I, could rely upon when, I had a question going forward. I didn't do that. I was more lazy and only really did it when someone reached out to me. So I think I'm realizing now that networking really is important in the business world. And, I sort of have a new appreciation for how to go about it.
You'd be surprised as well, though, Nick, like your advisors and banks and all of these people that you've dealt with, you are indirectly doing it through those guys, and those guys are all very well networked as well. So it's just one of those things that you probably don't realize how much you were doing, but just not having a specifically proactive approach to it.
Yeah.
And what about mentors? Have mentors been a part of your career at all? I know there's a lot of us of a certain generation where it's not really a part of what happened. Did you have mentors throughout the journey?
Yeah, at PG&E, mentoring is a big hot topic, and we put in place a lot of programs for our younger employees to try to provide them with those mentoring relationships, some successfully, some not successfully. I would say I haven't had many formal mentor relationships in my career. I have had people who I respect, whether they're bosses. They say, I guess your boss is not supposed to be your mentor, but bosses, as I said, who have really taken an interest in my career and helped me develop my skill set. So these are people I've gone to, told them what I want to accomplish in life, where I want to go, whether that's be a CFO or whatever, or develop a certain skill, and they've helped me accomplish that. So I guess in some sense, those are mentors. I haven't viewed them that way. They're more just boss-employee relationships. But I've also had peers at PG&E, people who I've respected, who after, sort of after a big meeting takes place, I'll call them up, pick their brain. What do you think of that? What do you think our boss meant by that? And so I guess those are sort of informal mentor relationships. And those are people I've just developed relationships along the way. We go have coffee, lunch, but I've never thought of them as sort of the formal mentoring that I see a lot of, at least the younger employees, search for at PG&E.
And if you had the opportunity, the 25-year-old you is sat in front of you, and you wanted to give some advice on, what you wish you knew when you were 25 and starting your career, what would you say?
Yeah, I would, I guess the advice I would give a young employee who wants to be treasurer someday is to try and swim outside your swim lane. What I mean by that is I think too often treasurers, and maybe this would apply to any sort of finance field, but I think treasurers specifically, we really take a lot of pride in becoming subject matter experts. And really diving into the depth of our craft, knowing everything there is to know about, a certain financial product or analysis or the markets, which is important. I'm not trying to say we shouldn't do that, but I think too often we don't see the bigger picture. And so I would advise people to expand beyond just treasury. There's several ways that I feel like I've tried to do that. One is to really understand the business that your company operates in. So at PG&E, obviously, I wasn't a utility expert coming in, and I wish I had done this earlier in my career. I'd like to think I caught up later on, but really take the time to understand the business, the environment. For us at PG&E, it was important, to go out in the field, so to speak. I think that adds a lot of context and allows you to be a much better treasurer along the way, to understand, what are the assets that you're financing? What is the business? What are the drivers? What are the risks? How could there be a liquidity crunch? I also, so in addition to understand the business, I would encourage employees to expand beyond just the core treasury function within finance. What I mean by that is, too often we think that we're only knowledgeable in our specific area of expertise, whether that's treasury, or I don't want to speak for other areas, but it could be controller or tax or whatever the functional area is. And we don't move outside of our four corners of our walls. And the fact of the matter is, and we do that because we're, I think, insecure. We don't think we know as much about that area. I'm just a treasurer. That's all I know. I'm going to stay within my swim lane, to use that metaphor again. But the fact of the matter is, if we're talking about treasurers, sort of senior employees, we're all smart people. And I think I wish I had more confidence earlier in my career to speak up, to lend a hand, to try and offer advice for my peers, even if it wasn't within the treasury area, because I think that's really what CFOs and senior leadership are looking for in the future CFOs and those who are going to be promoted, or people who can be, yes, they're subject matter experts and great treasurers. That's important. So I don't want to take away from that, but you got to also be able to expand beyond just the four corners of treasury. You got to be able to someone who can understand strategy, who can understand the implications of decisions within treasury, how they impact the business, how they impact accounting, how they impact tax, whatever the case may be. And again, the advice I'd give someone is to make a more concerted effort earlier in your career to raise your hand, to speak up. Don't be afraid that you're wrong, and really try and move beyond just treasury.
Nick, you've run a team, a reasonably large team within the PG&E Treasury. What are the key things you look for when hiring into the Treasury team?
Yeah, it's interesting. I may have a specific hiring approach. It doesn't always exactly link up with maybe what PG&E HR wanted, but I feel like it's worked for me. And that is what I generally look for, is what I learned this term at Morgan Stanley. I'm sure it's used at many firms, is I like good athletes. I don't tell this to our bosses, but treasury is not rocket science. And my belief, maybe if you're hiring a treasurer, you need someone who's very experienced in treasury. But if we're talking, an analyst or a manager or even sort of a assistant treasurer, I feel like I can teach the treasury skill set to a smart person. And so what I'm looking for employees is someone who is smart, capable, a good communicator, strategic. Yes, it'd be nice if they have some familiarity with a balance sheet and financial markets and know some of the terms. But really, it's not a requirement in my mind. I'm looking for, again, what the term we used is just good athletes, and I can teach them the treasury skill. And that seems to have worked well for me. I can point to the now treasurer at PG&E, who I hired back when she was a manager, and she was nervous. She had no treasury experience, didn't know anything about the business, and I had to convince her that I'll teach you that. I had confidence that she was smart and capable, and obviously it worked out. So that's really what I look for in employees.
And I think, like, to back yourself to be able to train someone, if you can get good athletes, and I think it's a really, in my view, it's a very forward-thinking manager that thinks like that, to say, you give me a good, smart, capable person who's driven, I can teach the rest. And I tend to agree with you. I think, to me, I'm not a treasury person, by the way. I couldn't do your job as a treasurer, but I look at it in terms of recruiting those roles. And I agree. I think if you've got a smart person, the good thing about treasury is it's logical. It's about, if you do certain things, there'll be certain outcomes. And it's not, there's definitely some subject matter expertise, particularly around financial markets, when you start getting into commodities or risk management, FX, that side of things. But outside of that, I think the rest of it is good logical stuff. That, I love your term of an athlete. If you get an athlete, you can teach all of that stuff, definitely.
Yeah.
What and in terms of the treasurer role then, Nick, what do you think, in the eyes of a CFO and the CEO and the board, makes a successful treasurer?
Yeah, I think if we're looking, I'll answer it with that question the way you phrased it, as a good treasurer, because I think there's a different question of what makes a good executive, and if you want to become a CFO, that's a different question. But for someone who's just looking to be a good treasurer, I think the skill you need to be, and as a little, going back a little bit what I said before, but you do need to be a subject matter expert. When you walk into the boardroom or meeting with the CEO or you're briefing the CFO, they're going to want someone who's very confident in the topics, the markets. Typically, you're not having CEOs who have come up through Treasury. And unfortunately, I wish it was more the case. You don't have a ton of CFOs who've come up through Treasury. So they're really going to be sort of delegating that skill set to you as the treasurer. So you got to have that subject matter expertise, who they feel confident knows your stuff. But I think that's sort of, I guess you'd call the table stakes. And hopefully all treasurers have that. I think what makes a great treasurer, a really good treasurer, is people who can take that subject matter expertise and make it very, and communicate it in a way to the audience. So we're talking board members or senior executives, in a way that they can understand. Again, keeping in mind that they are not sort of practitioners of the treasury function. So, I don't want to, I guess this term sounds bad, but I use it, dumbing it down a little bit, to sort of leveling the detail. I think too often I see many of my employees who are so proud in the analysis and their understanding of the topic that they'll send emails to me that are, 5 pages long, or, and that's not what the CEO or CFO wants. They want the snippets, the punchline, I call it. You got to be able to summarize the details in a way that they can understand, and in a way that they can consume that information and do something with it. So I think that's the really differentiating skill. A lot of us know our stuff really well, but it's sort of taking that details, the expertise, and communicating in a way at a high enough level that someone who only has 5 minutes or 10 minutes, or maybe if it's a 30-minute meeting, can understand.
Definitely. And I think, yeah, absolutely. It's summarizing everything. Well, I've just lost the train of thought of what I was going to say there. There's a term that you just basically said to me, and I've just lost my train of thought on it. Sorry. But
people have it's really hard for, well, maybe it's hard for anyone, but especially smart people who know the topic so well, to put together a 1-page memo. It's much harder than putting together a 20-page memo or something like that. So I think that's a skill that not everyone has, on sort of summarizing complex materials to diverse audiences so that they can do something with it. That's also the importance. Like you gotta remember that what does this audience, so here we're talking about the CEO or the CFO or the board, what do they need to know? And what do they need to know so they can make a decision if a decision needs to be made? And so I think that's important to think through that lens.
Absolutely. And one last question for you, Nick. The treasurer role, everyone's talking about technology now is advancing so quickly. How do you see the treasurer role changing in the next couple of years with that tech advancement?
That's, I don't know if I have a great answer for that question. I don't see it changing a ton, to be honest, at least the treasurer role. Obviously, there's a lot of detail within the treasury function, treasury ops specifically, where technology is really, enabling a lot better decision making and a much more efficiency. But the treasurer role specifically, I think, I spend most of my time relationship management. That's my own team. So I spend a lot of time on leadership. That's obviously very important. I spend a lot of time building relationships with what we call it at PG&E, the lines of businesses. So those are our sort of internal clients. And I spent a lot, probably the most time, with the external financial community, them being banks, rating agencies, fixed income and equity investors. And so I'm not sure technology is going to change those interactions as much. But definitely will have an impact on sort of the treasury ops side of the table. But as I said, I probably spent less of my time there and delegated more of that to my team, who'd probably be better able to answer some of the details.
Nick, I think that's a great answer. Don't say that's not a good answer at all. That's a brilliant answer. And I think you've summarized it perfectly, because technology doesn't really change relationships. And, that's the fundamental part of being a great treasurer. So 100% agree with you.
Yeah, I think that go back, I don't mean to change an answer I gave before. I think you had asked, what advice would I give young up and coming treasurers? And I probably would add to what I said before and sort of, getting out of our swim lanes. And that is to focus as much, if not more, on the softer side of the business and building those relationships. I think, especially early in your career, you probably want to become such a subject matter expert, know everything about hedge accounting or foreign exchange or the markets or a product, how a convertible works. And that's important. But I would advise young employees to spend as much, if not more, time on the softer side, learning how to manage teams, learning how to develop relationships internally. And again, what I think is probably what makes the most effective treasurers, it's those relationships outside of the company. I mean, at PG&E, we are a heavy user of capital. We have large credit facilities. And so relationships with the banking community was probably my number one focus that I had, as well as rating agencies and the investment community. And a lot of treasurers are maybe not as comfortable in sort of the social interactions and maybe more comfortable working inside their office. But I would really push employees to flex and try and build that muscle, because I think that's very important. At least it was for me at PG&E.
And I think to some degree, the younger generation has grown up with technology, and without saying, not hide behind it, but you can get away with a lot more these days, not having to pick up the phone, just using the technology to make it work. So I really agree. I think it's a really important skill set that I know I say to my kids all the time. I think it's the most important skill for them, because technology does so much else. It can't build relationships for you though.
Yep.
Well, Nick, thank you very much for coming on. It's been a pleasure chatting to you today, and I've really appreciated your insights.
Great. Thanks, Simon.
Thanks a lot.